I'd like to welcome all of you, and I'm not sure you can all hear me. Carlo, are we good? Okay. I'd like to welcome all of you to this very special evening event, and it is my pleasure on behalf of the Washington Theological Consortium to introduce to you in a moment the main sponsor of this event, and in a few more moments the panelists that we have before us. The Consortium, just so you know, is a community of 10 graduate theological schools in the Christian community, Roman Catholic, Byzantine Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical, historic Black divinity schools. Most flavors of Christians we deal with in our graduate education. And we also have partners in Islamic and Jewish and spirituality studies. Our two main commitments are to foster greater ecumenism or Christian unity among the schools and the students, and to foster interfaith dialogue and understanding. Part of the joy of this particular event every year is that it is committed to interfaith dialogue and peace building. And thanks to the support and the vision of Tachmindji, we can all be here this evening and enjoy this very powerful night. And I'd like to invite Diane to welcome you for herself.
I don't know, I'm not used to this. Well, I thank you personally, every one of you for being here. Very
You need the microphone.
Okay. Can you hear me?
No.
Okay.
Try that.
All right.
No.
Welcome. Well, I'll just speak.
There you go.
There you go. All right, so welcome. And I have already thanked profusely on many occasions as I've gotten to know the panelists over the last several months, as well as Marc Gopin, who is moderating today, for their participation, for sharing. They're going to be sharing with me today, which is so special. It's going to be so powerful. And I really don't want to take even a minute longer delay from what you're about to hear. So I'm going to be very brief. The title of the panel discussion, The Power of Community, is key. We don't choose the community into which we were born or which we were raised, but we can choose the communities that follow. You're going to hear the story of the transition from one community to another, and I know you're going to be both enlightened and inspired by it.
I just want to give a quick picture of where our panelists are right now in their lives, because you will get much more information about their journey to this place. We are thrilled that Allison Gornik is in the city doing a residency in her doctorate for clinical psychology. She's at Children's National. We're delighted that Derek Black is now in a program at the University of Chicago studying the medieval and early modern roots of racism, anti-Semitism. And I'll get to Marc in a moment, and then Matthew Stevenson, we're delighted, he's not too far in the area, in Baltimore now, and he is an investment analyst with T. Rowe Price. The journey that has taken place here is one of siloed communities coming together in a new community, helping growth and transformation to take place. I think for all three of these young people who met at New College in Florida, but also the discovery of a kind of new viewpoint on the world. It's a special significance and poignance to me because of the power of friendship and community to help bring about ethical and belief change, and should interest all people interested in ethics and goodwill and the transformation that's possible in change in our world. We're deeply honored to have Dr. Marc Gopin be our moderator for the panelists tonight. Dr. Gopin is the James H. Lau Professor of Religion, Diplomacy, and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, and he is the director of a very special center dedicated to world religions, world religions diplomacy and conflict resolution. He is a prolific author. He has done research in battle-tested conflict parts of the world like Syria and Palestine, Israel. He is dedicated to bringing forth the stories of on-the-ground, community-based peacemakers that really cross bridges to build about peace in their community. And his current research is focused on neuroscience, ethics, and conflict resolution. So, Marc, we welcome you tonight.
Well, we're going to spend some good time together because we'll have a nice conversation up here for a while. I'll be sitting down soon and we'll have a conversation with the panelists about their story and then probing that in a very deep way. And then we're going to ask you to have some pertinent questions that will help us deepen the conversation, especially with the background that people have in this community and in this particular city, so that we can deepen this experience and this conversation and learn from it. And many of you come from different walks of life. Some of you are from academia, some of you from policy, and some of you from very experienced interfaith work. And basically, but let me introduce this as and put the context on why this evolved. These three extraordinary young people, Matthew, Derek, and Allison, are quite well known in the country now for the extraordinary experience that they had in university together several years back, and we'll tell the story soon. I want to put it in context of some of the reasons why I have shifted some of my 30 years of work overseas on religion, peace building, and extremism to a deep interest, almost a panicked deep interest that many of my colleagues have now taken in the domestic situation in the United States and in Europe and in other parts of the developed world. And the reason for that is that there has been a very, very sharp rise in the last 3 years of crimes, hate crimes against ethnic and religious groups. Some years a 37% rise. And we're at a point now between the black church burnings, the synagogue attacks, at least three synagogue attacks, the mass shooter events from El Paso all the way to Australia, at an unprecedented reframing of 20 years of experience, and perhaps more. I'd say maybe 30 or 40 years of saying the word terrorism, but in fact terrorism being kind of a euphemism for overseas terrorism, for terrorism based on extremism in other religions. This has changed. And it is very difficult for cultures to face something that's happening from within them. It's very painful. And one of the things that I've tried to work on for the last 30 years is helping people face their own societies in a compassionate way. I leave to security services and others to face it in a military way. Others still to face it in a legal way. And there are many people in the United States, once we start realizing that this is a serious problem, we'll shift the legalities of this. We'll start to focus on who is the new enemy. But as you know, many of you, you can only go so far by deciding that somebody is now the enemy. And in fact, it creates a system of escalated action-reaction spirals that generally create far worse results by your very intentions to actually make everybody safe. So the question, the difficult question for humanity, and this applies to my students and my colleagues and friends living in Syrian camps across Syria, the women who are part of our schools in Syria and Turkey and Jordan, it applies to all of us in any situation where we are being attacked and we feel threatened and vulnerable, and at the same time we sense that if we counterattack, we're just going to make things worse. So what do we do? How are you safe? So it is in that context that I started a journey on looking in the American scene for extraordinary people who have a completely different relationship to the nature of threat around them, to the way in which they react to difficulties and moments of fear in meeting the other. So that's the interest today. So as we have this conversation, just keep in mind that what we're looking at and exploring, and each one of us matter in this, because in the field of ethics and neuroscience, the more that all of us start to focus on our thoughts and our intentions and get control of our minds and bring our minds to its best expression, it doesn't mean we're all going to agree politically. It doesn't mean that all our theology is going to start becoming one. It doesn't mean we're going to agree on every ethical issue. But we will start to become less and less violent in our intentions, in our thoughts, and in our courses of action with each other as community. And that's what we're going to see today. So let's begin this story, and then we'll open it up to everybody after that story. So now I'm going to sit down. Okay, folks. So we're going to share the mic over here, and you're going to share the mic over there. Is that all right? So what's very important from the very beginning. Sorry. How is this? Okay. So you and I are going to have to be a little bit more intimate. So I'm not looking at my texts, I promise. I'm just looking at my notes. Okay. So in this, we feel as a group, as a community, we've got to know each other really well. And it's very important that I want to begin with Derek. And for Derek to tell his story as a summary in order to set the context for the rest of the story, in order for all of us in the room to be on the same table with this very unusual story. It's just different. And I want everybody to understand the beginning of it, the end of it, and the evolution before we begin a more complicated approach.
So by the time that I was born, my family had already spent nearly 40 years developing what they termed the white nationalist movement. My father was responsible for popularizing the term. Sure. My father was responsible for popularizing the term white nationalism. He had become involved in it when he was 16 years old. He grew up in northern Alabama to a fairly average middle-class white family, which means that they had fairly garden stock racist ideas, but were not extremists. They were always shocked at what he later became involved in. He met David Duke, who went on to become one of probably the most prominent white supremacist politician in the 80s and 90s when he was a teenager. And so by the time that I was born, they had already come through founding a chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1970s, ending that chapter in the early 80s when they decided that its brand would never be able to catch on with mainstream people. They had formed political parties. David Duke, who was always very close to my family, even up until and after when I was born, had run for political office in Louisiana and had won. My mother was David Duke's first wife, and then became my father's wife, and I was born at this point right after David won political office in Louisiana. All the campaigns that he ran after that, when I was very little, he was unsuccessful at. He ran for governor of Louisiana and lost. He ran for Senate in Louisiana and lost. But there was always a real sense that they could break through with the message of white nationalism to fairly mainstream people. And so that was the milieu that I was surrounded by. Growing up, leaders of the white nationalist movement would regularly come to our house for Christmas parties. When I got a little older, we would travel the country and go to conferences that were held in hotels and had $200 admission fees and banquets, and we'd have tenured professors come and lecture us on why race was biological and real and predicted crime and predicted IQ and all these things that are not statistically true, but that they used to justify their ideology. And there were times that it really felt like they were correct in their assumption that the beliefs that white nationalism clung to were just more extreme versions of what existed in broader society. Like throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, my family would regularly show up to country music concerts because there were hundreds of Confederate flags flying, and it was an almost exclusively white audience, and my dad identified that as a space where there was something race-oriented happening. And he would view people like that who would never call themselves racist as people who were a little bit closer to his ideology, people who thought that there was too much immigration in America, or that immigration from non-white countries was not as good as immigration from European countries. This was his worldview, and he really believed that he could get a mass movement going. And he never really was able to do that, but I became enraptured with it. I thought that it was absolutely correct, and I was a true believer in the ideology as a teenager. When I was 16, I ran an online radio program on Stormfront, which was the largest and first white nationalist website, which my father created when the web was young. I got volunteers to operate it 24 hours a day. When I was 19, I ran for a local Republican county-wide seat in Palm Beach County, and I won that with 60% of the vote, going around giving all the talking points that white nationalists used without identifying myself as white nationalist. That became a national story, and the Republican Party didn't seat me, but it really confirmed for me that they were right. They could get some kind of mass support if they packaged it right. And so I really oriented myself around that. And it was at that point that I went away to college. And that's where most of this story happens. I showed up at college when I was 20, absolutely committed to white nationalism.
So can I just ask you to elaborate on one point? So
what is white nationalism?
No, that's, I think people are pretty aware.
I mean, actually, that might be worthwhile to talk about.
Yeah, I might be. So why don't you define it after this? But I just want to ask you, it sounds to me like you were doing pioneering work that was helping the message get across in radio and social media. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
That you helped the older generation?
And I was born into the family that started white nationalism online, that created the first online presence. And so there was already a circle of people who were thinking about language and thinking about memes and thinking about how to flood the comment sections of newspapers when they first got websites, the things that were fairly innovative at the time, and they were really thinking about how to broaden that message.
And so if you could also, so define white nationalism as they understand it, as your elders understood it, and then also if you could just describe the reasons why your father decided to send you to this university, and particularly in the way in which you entered. I mean, I want to understand deeply his understanding or his motivations for sending you to a fairly liberal university. Sure.
Academics, I think it's important to just lay out terminology. Academics tend to define white nationalism as the small social movement that has 30,000, 40,000 adherents. It's hard to know exact numbers. And there are people who know each other, who marry within a movement, who are committed to it, who donate money, who volunteer, who this is their life, and white supremacy as a broader system of discrimination that affects all of society. That tends to be the way academics split this up, and white nationalists use the term white nationalism because they say that they don't want anything bad for other people. They're able to tell themselves that they're not supremacist or racist because they just want worldwide apartheid. They want everybody to live separately and happily, as they'll put it, and they'll never answer the question of what sort of violence and coercion are you going to implement to get there. It always remains in this space that they're convinced that everybody wants worldwide segregation, and they tell themselves that. And that's why they're not the supremacists. That's what they'll say. You don't have to think about that for very long to see how quite hateful that is. In terms of college, he didn't really send me. It's kind of the mundane answer was that what was the right option. And Florida had low in-state tuition, and this was the honors college for the state of Florida. And the answer is that I was so convicted that I couldn't have my mind changed. That it didn't matter that this liberal arts college with 800 students was ranked as the most leftist school in America, the most pot-friendly school in America, and the most gay-friendly school in America, that at worst, I would learn the arguments that the left used, that what we call the anti-whites used against white nationalism, so that I'd better understand how to outsmart them.
And he had a fairly intellectual approach to the framing of things, and because you were quite learned by the time you got there, and that's interesting too. This was not. Could you say a little bit about the fact that he is part of the elite of this movement? It's very different than the average, more thuggish image people have of the followers, with the tattoos and in gangs and beating people up and burning churches. So it's very. I think it's important for people to understand what's that fit, because you were right in the middle of that.
Right, and in that, on the personal level, my life always felt very sophisticated because we were hearing from academics, we were going to fancy banquets, we were wearing suits and ties, and we could all tell ourselves that we were very sophisticated and not hateful and not thuggish and not uneducated. Everybody in my family had college degrees. And to really understand that, though, it's all part of the same system. There's always been, as long as the white nationalist movement has existed since the end of the 1960s, there's been the mainstream side and the illegal side. The people committing crimes is not something that's happened since 2014. It's something that has happened since the 1970s. And the people who present themselves as being mainstream always had some level of separation, but it's not nearly as formal as they like to make it seem. It's always been people who knew people who were committing violent acts or who were organizing some kind of organized crime. And so the difference between the white nationalists presenting themselves for office and winning public office was real from the person who was going out and committing violent acts, but the ideology was identical. And the way they spread their message was always identical. And so my dad can say that he is not responsible for the attacks that continue to happen, that have always happen year after year, because on Stormfront it is against the rules to advocate violence. It's against the rules to advocate anything illegal. And so whenever there's an attack, he can say, I didn't want that to happen, I didn't endorse it, and so therefore it's not my fault if there's some person out there who acts this way. And the obvious response is, if you create a worldview that defines who is the enemy and who doesn't belong, and then someone who believes everything you do commits violence against those people, how can you say you're not in any way morally responsible for it? But that's how they rationalize it.
Yeah, and I was just on the website, and I was fascinated to see an entire discussion, and almost like a rebuke of a lot of the other writers for not keeping it positive, of saying that it was straight out of positive psychology recommendations, is that we have to see the positive, we have to frame the positive. So the whole movement that you grew up in actually had a kind of visionary quality to it.
It was a movement that viewed itself as not the fringe. It didn't want to see itself as the fringe. It didn't want to be seen as the lowlifes. And in a real way, that's not an accurate description. I mean, I would say the average person in the white nationalist movement has some sort of post-secondary education. The people who showed up, even at the Charlottesville rally, if you just started thinking about the logistics, they had to be able to take off time from work. They had to be able to drive across the country. They had to be able to find housing to get there. It's not a movement of people who are completely impoverished. It's typically a movement of people who have a little bit of money to donate, to run things, to organize rallies, and I think that's the right way to think about who these people are.
So you come to the university very educated, very focused on reasoning, and what happens between then and 2013 that you become, your affiliations become entirely different?
It's a longer conversation.
Well, how about just say, you know, the years, and then we'll bring in Allison and
Sure. Feels they're in the wings. So arriving in college, just the overview then is arriving in college, I had absolute commitment to the white nationalist movement. I did not think that my mind could be changed, but I also had the worldview about myself that I could be friends to anyone, that there was no individual person who I couldn't, I wouldn't want to be the kind of person who couldn't interact with anyone. That was my own personal view. And so for a semester, no one knew my background. Had made national news on the other side of the state, but when I went to the West Coast, just nobody happened to Google me for a semester. I got to know lots of people, and I made friends that would eventually be destroyed when my background did come out. And so the second semester I was studying abroad, a student identified me while I was gone and posted on the student email forum, "This is Derek Black, and he apparently goes to the school. Does anybody know him?" And it was 1,000 messages over days, this longest thread that I'd ever seen on this student communication forum where everybody was automatically subscribed, just trying to decide what to do about it, because they were a community that was not willing to accept white supremacy in ways that had not really been true before. I had always lived in a fairly urban area in South Florida, and I was familiar with diversity, but every time I interacted with someone, usually, and I was homeschooled, so those someones that I interacted with were different from the norm, they would still find out about my background and then say, okay, but let's just not talk about that. We'll talk about whatever it is we are doing. And it became very clear very fast that at New College, it was not going to be acceptable to say, we'll talk about something else. That their immediate reaction was to say that white supremacy is not acceptable here because it endangers members of our own community. So the overwhelming reaction was absolute condemnation and asserting that condemning white supremacy and anyone who's advocating it is protecting the people who are being attacked by it or being marginalized by it and making the community safe for people of color, for Jewish students. And I look back now and I think that was such a powerful thing, but at the time it was one of the biggest moments of ostracism that I had ever experienced, and that's what I came back to school seeing.
What exact month and year was that?
I arrived back in August of 2011.
August of 2011. And then when was your official renunciation of white nationalism?
Summer of the 2013, and everything happened in between that point.
Okay. So if you can, narrative is very important in understanding human relations and the evolution of relations. It's extremely important in understanding how enemies become friends, how people evolve. So we're in between August of 2011 and the summer of 2013.
Yeah.
But I want you to take a step back to these other two extraordinary people here. And I want to ask when they entered the story and when they first met Derek and what happened. So first I'll begin with Matt. And say a little about your own background of your family values, your spiritual values, and like a little bit of who you are, and then why you were at that university and how you met.
Sure. How is this volume-wise? Good? I'm really bad with holding microphones, so this may change. So my name is Matthew Stevenson, originally from Miami, Florida. Grew up, I think, really influenced by two strong spiritual traditions, for lack of a better word. Through my father, I became very connected to an organization called the Kabbalah Center, which is an organization which I think, you can talk about a lot of things, but as far as the context of this story is concerned, really imbued with me the idea that anybody, regardless of their beliefs or their background or what have you is created in the image of God. And it is not up to me to treat them with something less than human dignity. Even if I feel like, to love your neighbor as yourself is something which is, I think, beyond certainly beyond me, but probably beyond most of us. But I think we can all treat people with human dignity. And so that was instilled in me very, very strongly from a young age. For my mother was an alcoholic, and she became sober when I was about 7 or 8. And I used to go with her to open meetings in AA. Open meeting, for those who don't know, is an AA meeting which you can attend even if you yourself are not an alcoholic. I wasn't, I was 8. But I had a remarkable experience. I was, as you might imagine, the only child in the room, and she would also tend to go to rooms which were, it turns out rich people drink too, but she would go to rooms in sort of the roughest parts of the city for whatever reason. And so I got to know many people who came from very, very different socioeconomic status than myself, people who were very, very impoverished, homeless people, etc. And I also saw people who had been in incredibly dark places and yet completely transformed that, so that not only were they no longer sort of cyclones of destruction in the world around them, but actually became beacons of light. I knew a guy who had run while drunk, backed out of his driveway, running over his son, killed him. This is something which is, I think, for any of us, sort of shocking and unbelievably, probably, I'm sure, impossible to get over. But yet he was also able to become a sponsor for other people in the program and help others become clean and sober and make sure that they didn't have to experience the same pain and suffering that he had experienced. And so this idea that anyone can change and transform, regardless of what they've done or who they've been, was, I think, it was and is very central to my worldview. And
So then you come to the university, and you're in your dorm. What happens next in terms of Mr. Derek over here?
Sure. So I actually entered New College the same time as Derek, and the way the dorms were structured, sort of they faced the outside. So when I opened my dorm room door, front door to my dorm, I could look down and see his front door. So we were kind of neighbors, and he used to sit outside and play guitar in some of the common areas. And he used to, despite his earlier comments about country music, I also enjoy country music, although I'm not a white nationalist. That was not clear. So he used to go and sit outside and play guitar, and I would sing along poorly. And we knew each other, but not well. I had his, we watched a movie together one time in his dorm room, and had taken a class together. So I knew him, I had his phone number, but had absolutely no idea about his ideological beliefs.
So now I want to turn to Allison, and if you could explain your context and background, and when was the first time you met Matthew and Derek?
So, can everybody hear me? No.
Just a little bit closer.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. So I was born and raised outside of Cleveland, Ohio. So moved to Florida because, as Derek referenced, Florida has very affordable in-state tuition. So I deferred for a year to live and work there, to be in residency, to then attend the public honors college. So I had moved across the country for college, and before Derek's sort of big reveal on campus from everybody, did not know him. So was not friends with him, and Matthew and I were fairly good friends beforehand, and so starting our second year, we were suite mates, which is when Derek had come back to campus. And so I think then the story goes back to Matthew, and I'm pretty out of it for the first few weeks.
For the first few weeks, okay. So back to Matthew. Actually, I want to ask you, Derek, now. You're in the middle of that storm, of seeing that everybody has exposed you. And what happens, what kind of communication happens here next?
Right. When I first got back, I had to look for an apartment off campus because I had been originally required to stay on campus like most everyone, but after I was outed, the administration sent me a follow-up email without any explanation saying, actually, if you want to stay off campus, that's fine. So at the last second, I had to find somewhere because that actually seemed preferable. Like the first night I was back, I tried to go to one of the outdoor parties because it was Florida that they would have every Friday and Saturday night. And people immediately started recognizing me and started coming up to me, and it became very clear that I was not welcomed in that space. And so it was also very clear that being off campus was necessary. And so as soon as I was back in the country, one of the first texts I got was actually from Matthew, who was
What did the text say?
he was messaging, he said, oh, I heard you've switched and you're going to go off campus now. Let me know if you need any help finding a place or if you need anywhere to crash while you're looking for a spot. And
Okay.
that was the first communication he and I had had since, I think, trading study guides for the final exam in the class we took together.
So I need to ask Matthew a question now. What were you thinking? My God. I mean, I'm 62 years old, and I've grown up very Jewish. I keep the Sabbath and all these other crazy stuff that even I do. And I'm in a very, very small world of people who have a very particular projection, history. I mean, I lived with the Holocaust. I lived with the images of the villages we came from. And you hear this, and your first instinct is to call him up and ask him if he needs some help. What happened?
Once again, volume okay? Yeah. Okay. First of all, I think it's worth pointing out that I'm not, and was not, naive about the effects of anti-Semitism. I remember, just as one anecdote, when I was about 12, I was in Italy. I was in Pisa, and if you've ever been there, the Leaning Tower is sort of surrounded by an area called the Square of Miracles, and I'm not sure what it's like now, but at that time there were a lot of stalls, a little outdoor market area, and I was there under this sort of student group, not a Jewish student group. I think I was the only, at least externally, obviously observant person there. And I remember being chased by a group of, let's say, 6 to 8 older guys. When you're 12, people seem pretty big, so I don't know if they were 16 or 18 or 20, but being spat on and jeered at and otherwise sort of terrorized. And I've unfortunately had a number of experiences like that over the course of my life, to the extent that it's not an uncommon experience, especially in traveling in certain parts of the world. So I was not naive to think that white nationalism or anti-Semitism or racism were somehow neutral ideologies or harmless ideologies. With that being said, Derek was a human being, and I knew him. And I knew, because I knew one of the guys that he was supposed to have been roommates with, that his plans had changed quite abruptly, and possibly, involuntarily. And he needed help, potentially. I didn't know if he needed help or not, but I'm not going to let him be homeless just because I disagree with him. I think that the fact that I vehemently disagreed with his ideology, obviously, it's an ideology which attacks Jews as well as people of color and other kind of, turns out they have quite a long list they don't like. But that fact doesn't separate the fact that he's a human being, and if I can do something for him, I wasn't aiding the movement, so to speak, but if I can help him, I feel like it's my obligation to do so. I have an obligation towards people that transcends my ideology, their ideology.
So I I have to say, I've been studying these three people for quite some time, and it took a lot to orchestrate to have the privilege of having them here. They've been on NPR, they've been at the Holocaust Museum, they've been speaking all over, and it was only Thursday night, sitting over dinner, that I heard about this text. And, you know, because I spent half my life studying ancient sources, I start to freak out from this ancient source, because it's from 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, in the book of Proverbs, which is in both the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament of the Christian world as well. And it says, if you see your enemy faltering, help him. It says it also in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but in Mishlei, in Proverbs, it says, if you see your enemy faltering, and we don't understand the Hebrew very well, but it says something crazy. It says, because you will heap fires of coal on his head.
Yes.
Crazy verse. There's a lot of crazy verses. And this is a crazy verse. And I didn't understand it for my whole life until I started studying neuroscience, because neuroscience says that shock and surprise lights up the whole brain in the fMRIs. It's like, whoa, these poets and prophets from the ancient world were pretty prophetic, for lack of a better word. And the idea was that, and the rabbis later explained about 2,000 years ago, that it meant that you will create such a shock that they will say, I thought they were my enemies, but I guess they're not, and I need to change. So I'm sitting there at dinner with you guys trying to contain myself, and you're just telling me about this text, and I freak out because of the power of ideas. So we're talking about horrible ideas here, we're also talking about extraordinary ideas. And these extraordinary people who, for them, it just clicked. So after that text, and after, what happens next with the Friday night dinners? And do you want to describe that, Allison, of what happens next in the evolution of the relationships?
Yeah, so one of my favorite parts of college was that Matthew would host Shabbat dinners on Friday nights, which were open to whoever wanted to come to them. And so as his suite mate, it was this amazing get-together of friends every single week that I could sort of rely on and see all my friends, and it was really great. And then after Derek came back to campus, Matthew invited Derek to come to the Shabbat dinners. And I was very upset about this. I am not Jewish, I am white, and I felt like my support should not be towards sitting at dinner and theoretically giving somebody who believes in white nationalism a comfortable evening. I felt like my presence there sort of only supported that ideology, and instead my effort should be towards supporting people of color on campus or Jewish people on campus. And so I did not go to that Shabbat dinner. I think fairly surprising for everybody, Derek came back then week after week to these Shabbat dinners. And so instead of staying in my room and sort of making this big show of, no, I'm walking by the dinner, I'm going to my room, I'm not going to be part of this, I became very perplexed about this person who was sitting at these Shabbat dinners every Friday night and who, from what I could tell, had positive relationships with people of color on campus. And so I became very curious about how you can do that and still espouse these white nationalist beliefs. And those two things did not click with me, and I think that my mother raised me to be very curious, and I think she also raised me with a lot of confidence in myself that maybe at 19 was very strong. And so I felt like, okay, let me try to figure this out. And so I got to know Derek a little bit better. It's several months into the school year now. And after a few times of hanging out with him and being kind of surprised by how gentle and kind he seemed to be, which to me then just made the whole situation more perplexing, asked him directly, like, is white nationalism something we can talk about together? Like, would you even be open to that? Because up until that point, from what I could tell, there was nobody who was engaging with him to talk about these things. And I think that there is I think I'm a very firm believer in civil resistance. I think there is a lot of room for that. But I also think that people have different access points. And for me, very quiet conversations with people are where I feel most comfortable. And so I felt like, okay, if he is open to having these kinds of conversations, then those are conversations that I'm pretty obligated to have. And so he said yes, that he was open to talking about these things. And so that became about 1.5 years of where every 5th conversation or so was an argument about some sort of tenet of white nationalism.
Let me understand this. Again, I'm experiencing some shock, so I want to understand how this works. Because now you're, Allison is a brilliant student who's about to become a major psychologist, and so now you're into it. But back then, you're a college student. You're 19. Where do you get the thought that conversations is the reaction you want to have, and you feel obligated to conversations when so many other people are feeling extreme rage or fear?
Yeah.
Where did that come from?
Yeah, I think for me it was partly driven by a desire to understand. I felt like I didn't understand how anybody could subscribe to the tenets of white nationalism as I understood them. And if this person who is clearly very intelligent is having these very nice interactions and friendships, like real friendships from what I could tell, with people who his ideology excluded, then I wanted to understand how that could be true. And I think that our very first conversation after I asked him, is this something that you're willing to talk about with me? And he said yes. I think my next question was, could you explain it to me? Could you explain this ideology from your point of view? And what I heard from him seemed very rational and logic-based. Like, here are the very specific arguments I have for this, here are my pillars of beliefs, here's the statistics I believe in. And my reaction to that was, I think I can work with this, versus I felt like if his reaction would have been, well, I have this gut feeling that I don't like certain people who look like this. Like, I don't know what I would have done with that. And I think that evening that we were talking, he spent his whole life since he was like 10 talking to journalists and reporters about why white nationalism was correct and studying it. And I certainly have not spent my whole life thinking about race. And so I took a class on stigma and prejudice, and I did a whole DIY education on race, and kind of dedicated myself to this, as I think college students have a lot of time for in ways that other people don't. But also finding out, from Derek, why is this what you believe? Because the particular pillars of one person's belief system are just that one person's, right? Like, there's a lot of differences as to why people believe a certain ideology. And so finding out from him, what is your evidence, and what would you say if the evidence wasn't true? Like, how would that affect, what you believe? And then there was a lot of debating over empirical articles and going back to books and reading things and sending articles and having lots of arguments.
Let me ask a question, particularly because I've sat in Washington for the last 20 years of my life. This is a place filled with wonkish, intellectual people who, when they think about grand strategies and grand problems in the world, they open a book, or now they open Google and they do research. And you do a lot of research now for your program, but you did something very different, okay? And this is something that divides my own field of conflict analysis and resolution, and that is, there are the academics who actually are in the world, and then there are the academics who talk about the world, okay? You made a decision to look into Derek as a human being and say, I want to understand, which is very different than Googling Don Black and all the other things you could have done to understand the situation. So what gave you the courage to do that? Why did you do that?
I mean, I think I did both. I think I Googled his dad, I read things on Stormfront, I think I did a lot of background research about it. And I think that one of the reasons we're sitting here is because it worked. And so I think that in a lot of ways it was a really huge gamble, right? To spend a ton of time and to talk to him about these things, because I think that there was a real outcome where he would have ended up a better white nationalist if my arguments would have failed. Because when he first started talking to me, in part it was because he wanted to be somebody who argued based on real facts and real knowledge and science, and so he thought that if part of his argument was not working, then he should remove it. He didn't think that he would stop being a white nationalist, but he originally thought that arguing with me would make him better at this.
So to be clear for the audience, you were taking an ethical risk that you could be helping by giving him inside information on what was a good argument and what was a bad argument.
Well, I think that let's say if you have like 100 points of influence, I could have been spending my time trying to more directly support direct action of people of color on campus or Jewish groups on campus, and instead I'm sitting very quietly in places on campus talking to Derek in a way that, you know, I'm gambling these 100 points of influence in a way that maybe would have been more diffuse if I was using them elsewhere, probably maybe more effective if this thing with Derek didn't work.
Okay.
And so I think that really considering what is your access point and who you have and what you can do is very, very important, because I think in other situations, it would have been very different.
So I want, Matthew, could you react to this exchange? Do you have anything to add to the way that Allison was reasoning about this?
Sure. I think it's worth pointing out that when I invited Derek to the first Shabbat dinner, before he came, I told the people who were going to be coming, aside from him, that they should not bring up his background. This was not an ambush. This was not a chance to yell at Derek and scold him and tell him how wrong he was. I thought that having grown up in the environment that Derek did, as he mentioned earlier, his parents are very, very, very deeply involved in white nationalism. And I could even see myself that how much my parents influenced me. So if I had grown up in that environment, I probably would also have those views. And he had been homeschooled and so on. So I thought he may not have had a chance to actually spend much time at all, if any, with the kinds of people that his ideology despised. And not only that, but once he graduated from college, that he would likely be once again enmeshed in that white nationalist world and would maybe never have another opportunity to have those interactions and form those personal bonds and personal connections. And so I thought it was an opportunity, but also essentially an obligation to reach out and at the very least invite him to come. And at the end, if he comes and he doesn't want to come back, or he comes and he still holds those views, fine. At least he can't plead ignorance later on.
So did you consult with, so you're 19, did you consult with anybody before taking on this kind of responsibility?
No.
Okay then. I feel fulfilled as a parent. Anything can happen in college, literally. Okay, so I'm trying to internalize this because I'm hearing a lot of details too here. So I want to switch it back to Derek now, and I want to ask you how you react. What began happening with you, with Matthew and Allison in your life now, and whoever else was at the Sabbath meal that you were enjoying?
So my experience beginning in the semester when I got back was initially a reaction against the condemnation that I experienced in the community, because it felt more personal than anything I had happened to me before that, because I knew them, because I had taken classes with people who I was now reading described me as ignorant and hateful and stupid and hurting their lives, and there were people who I knew personally and did not want to hurt their lives. And my initial reaction to that was to organize a white nationalist seminar out of state, where we would come together and I'd get all the people who I had known over the years, and we would talk about why this was really the right ideology and how to argue it. What were the defenses against all the accusations of it being hateful? How could we be community organizers to get people together and more extreme in their white supremacist beliefs? And when I came back from that first seminar, which happened maybe a couple of weeks into my time back at New College, was when Matthew invited me to the first Shabbat dinner. It was on my way back, and then that first Friday back was when it happened. And so I was always very split. I was still doing the radio show that my dad now ran, but I would call into, although I started doing it a little bit less consistently. I started posting a little bit less consistently. I started engaging in the external world that my family was still running a little bit less consistently, because I was then going to these dinners, I was living on campus, I was reading forum wars where people were describing how toxic what I was doing was, and I didn't agree with them, but I was hearing them for the first time. Like, it wasn't the first time someone had said racism is bad, but it was the first time that people who I respected and cared about were doing that. And so I initially went to it to just figure out in what ways they were misunderstanding me. And I think that was one of my first questions that I asked Allison: in what way is this community misconstruing what I and my family say to believe that it's a threat to them, or that it's violent, or that it's that it is hateful? And those early conversations were just basically, how can you possibly believe that an ideology that says certain groups of people, whole swaths of America don't belong, is not harmful to them, is not hateful, is not targeting them? They're not misunderstanding. They've got it right when you were advocating this, and you say you're friends with some of them. How do you justify that? And that's when the conversation turned into why I thought it was factually right, why I thought it was morally right. And that was a bunch of different conversations. That was, let's talk about how white nationalists think IQ is based on race, and why that statistically does not make any sense. And there's why crime is predicted on race, and why that statistically doesn't make any sense. Why race is not a biological category, it's a socially constructed category, and how you talk about that. And each of those conversations weren't something that I had to immediately say, oh, okay, well, I was wrong. It was something I could think about for a month, and then slot it back into my toolbox and say, well, that one piece of evidence is not correct. It doesn't undermine an entire worldview that I've grown up with, that really seems reflected in some worldviews that people hold in America that seems like it's a part of our culture. And so each bit was never a huge leap. There was never any one moment. I think that's the main question I get now is, what was the one moment where everything changed? There wasn't any one moment. It was a combination of attending dinners, Matthew and I never bringing up white nationalism at dinner, but talking about everything else, and people at the Shabbat dinners usually not bringing it up, but every now and then saying, oh, can we go talk in private, and then being bewildered when I tried to describe to them why white supremacy made sense, and that their family somehow didn't belong, even though we were friends, and they would just never talk to me again and would just move on. And that happened. That took 2 years of this back and forth of thinking, well, it's more and more clear that it's not correct, and that it's morally indefensible, and that it's wrong. And that took a long time, but then it came to a point after 2 years of that where none of it was right. It was hurting people. It was not a good thing to defend, but everyone who I had known up until that point, and everyone in my family, was bonded by it. And that was what kept my entire network and my whole world together. And so condemning it, it could be one thing to be convinced that it was wrong. And it was a whole nother to say, I have to condemn it.
So let me just clarify something. These Sabbath meals, was there 2 loaves? And
Yeah, sure.
you did the Kiddush.
I said Kiddush, I did it too. Sorry. Yeah, 2 loaves, the Kiddush, the whole thing.
The sanctificate, the same.
Yeah, Kiddush is when it's a blessing over wine that's said at the beginning of the Sabbath meals. And then, yeah, we would eat. I would cook food beforehand, obviously. And then, it was probably what attracted, I think people didn't come for the Sabbath. I mean, they came for the salmon.
So let me understand something there. You were doing a Jewish ritual every Friday night. Were you telling your father about this?
No.
Were you telling your inner self? I mean, you were convinced of something, and you were also doing a Jewish ritual with a series of other people. Were you internalizing what was actually happening?
I think if you had asked me, I would have said there was no conflict, because I would have said that I can be friends with anyone, and that I can be in any social circle. And I think, and it's probably telling that I didn't, but had I explained it to my dad, I think he would have taken the same stance. With, oh, okay, you're getting better at arguing against them. You're now when you go off and run for something, you'll be able to say, look, I attended Shabbat dinners for 2 years. I think that's what my family, there were some points where that became closer to actually being a conflict, because at one point I wrote a public, the first time I wrote to the campus was clarifying some of the things like that, the fact that I could be friends with anyone, that I did not feel hate towards any, all these sort of things that were my own self-image, that I wanted people to feel less afraid. And that letter got leaked publicly, and my family and the whole white nationalist movement asked me about it. And actually pretty quickly they said, oh, okay, actually this will probably help your career, because look, you can be friends with them, you can't be a hate monger. And
Okay.
right.
All right, I'm just trying to understand this. This is, so could you, and then when do you decide to renounce fully? What happens?
It was after graduation. I had stayed in town in the summer of 2013 after graduating from school, which was still a year before Matthew and Allison, because I had transferred in. And so I was house sitting for some professors, my thesis advisor, who were out of town. And it was a series of really, like in my mind, almost more tense than the conversations about why white nationalism was wrong, that I really had an obligation to condemn it. That my instinct was to never speak again, was that it was wrong, and therefore I just would stop advocating it, and that would be enough. And the further conversations were that you can't push for something, you can't advocate something that inarguably makes the world worse and then just stop. That is unethical too. That I had an obligation to condemn it, to articulate why it was wrong, and to push back, because things just keep moving forward. What I had started would continue moving forward with or without me, but I could do something to try to slow it, to try to push back on it, and that was a responsibility. And then that took the form of writing a public letter explaining what the ideology was and why I was condemning it, and not telling my family that I was going to do it, which I still regret. That I was home actually the weekend before, and building windows and working on things, and I went out of town and then published this letter because I just couldn't tell them in advance. And so my dad's first reaction was to call me and say that he thought my email had been hacked. Because it just, he knew that I was not posting, he knew I had stopped doing the radio show, he knew I had stopped attending meetings, he knew, but he did not know, because I had not told him how much I had come to condemn the ideology. I tried to argue to him that family was not politics, and his response was, what in your entire experience of being in this family tells you that there's something that connects us other than politics? And that is what erased it. And it was not clear at that point whether we had any kind of communication.
But you regret to this day that you didn't tell him privately before going public.
Yeah.
Because, why?
Because our bond was always very close, it's still very close. He made a choice
So you
quickly after
you
that.
heard him.
Yeah, he made a choice quickly after that we had to be able to stay in touch, and so we can still talk. It's always tense, it's rare, but we're able to text and call because he made that choice. And we were always extremely close, and I think it was what I owed him to tell him in advance.
And why, if your bond was close with him and he accepted you despite this public renunciation of everything he had lived for, and in fact he spent time in prison for because of what he had done.
And he tried to invade an island.
He invaded an island.
Tried to invade an island.
Yeah. He tried to invade an island. I mean, it sounds silly, but you can look it up and Google it. But they tried to invade an island to restore an African dictator who actually was not white, but they wanted to use the island for a place to traffic casinos and have money laundering or some sort of scheme?
I think that was,
So
like I
it
said, I
sounds
don't
like
think he
they
was
do-
even 100% clear how they were going to, but it was a plan that they were convicted of a 1798 law of declaring war on a nation to which the United States government had not declared war. And so he served 2 years in prison for this, and they never got there.
And it was him and Duke that conspired to, or was just
I'm
your
not clear
involvement?
what David Duke's role was. He was somehow involved, but he did not.
Because it sounds
He did
so-
not get caught up in
It
it.
sounds so Black Klansman, which, you know, I don't know if you've seen the movie, but it's really an extraordinary movie. So you had this relationship.
Also, that was like 5 years before I was born.
Right. But what I'm trying to get at is that you maintained the relationship, you wanted to maintain the relationship, he wanted to maintain the relationship. And that's where, but you still had to go into hiding. You had to go into hiding for a while because of the other people in the movement?
I don't know specifically. There were lots of threats online. They were not usually directly specific. It was just sort of letting off steam. I don't know what direct concerns I had other than I wanted to abandon. I wanted to move away from this. And I also didn't see what my future looked like. At that point, I legally swapped my middle and first names, hoping that I could exist for a while at least without people being able to Google me, without people being able to see my background. I did not see a future where he used to be in the white nationalist movement was ever going to work for any sort of existence. And that was what I walked away expecting, that there was no real future. I could study and I could be in the archives and I could try to be, read a lot of books and write articles, but that there was no real social future for me at that point.
And where did, Allison and Matthew, either one of you where were you in this very dark period where he had renounced and has to change his identity? Do either one of you?
Maybe Allison wants to take this.
Yeah, I think that it was a lot of very difficult conversations. You're trying to argue that you have to renounce this because it is your obligation to do so because you've hurt so many people, when you know that that's going to really, really tear apart somebody that you really care about. And from his family and from his whole community, because he's been going to conferences since he was 8, and that was his whole community, And so I think that was a really difficult period. That summer I was at a National Science Foundation thing that I was at Virginia Tech for the summer, and then after you moved to Michigan to pursue graduate work after switching your first and middle names, Matthew and I were still at college for another year. And so I think that he was in Michigan trying to start this new life across the country, kind of start over and do good work there and focus on something else. And Matthew and I were still in college for another year, so trying to provide support from afar as much as we could.